What if I told you that one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 20th century, a man whose intellect was never questioned, made a historical claim so sweeping, so confident, and so utterly wrong that professional historians today cringe when they read it? Bertrand Russell, Nobel Prize winner, logician, one of the most influential thinkers of the modern era, wrote these words in his famous essay, Why I Am Not a Christian. Whether Christ ever actually existed in history is a matter of considerable doubt, and even if he existed, we can know nothing of substance about him. Sounds sophisticated, doesn't it? Sounds like the kind of thing a serious intellectual would say. There's just one problem. It's historically indefensible. My name is Alan, and today we're going to walk through one of the most fascinating and important questions you can ask. Was Jesus of Nazareth a real historical person? Not, was he the Son of God? That's a theological question, and we'll get there another day. Today, I'm asking the strictly historical question. Does the ancient world give us credible evidence that this man actually lived? By the time we're done today, you're going to see that the historical case for the existence of Jesus is not a matter of faith. It is a matter of evidence. Evidence from Roman historians who hated Christianity. Evidence from Jewish authorities who opposed Jesus. Evidence from ancient letters, manuscripts, and pre-New Testament documents. This teaching is based on the meticulous research of Josh McDowell from his landmark book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. The Christian faith is not a collection of spiritual ideas floating above history. The Christian faith is rooted in history. It stands or falls on historical events. The great New Testament scholar Donald Hagner put it this way: true Christianity, the Christianity of the New Testament, is absolutely based in history. The incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ are real events that happened in time and space. These historical facts are the indispensable foundation of Christian faith. That's why this matters. If Jesus never existed, then there is no gospel. There is no resurrection. There is no salvation. Everything collapses. But if Jesus did exist, as the evidence overwhelmingly shows, then we have to grapple seriously with who he was and what he claimed. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm arguing today. I'm not going to argue that ancient sources prove Jesus is the Son of God. What I'm arguing is far simpler and far more defensible, that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person who lived in first-century Palestine, who gathered a following, who was executed under Pontius Pilate, and whose movement continued to grow after his death. That is the historical claim, and the evidence for it is extraordinary. Professor F.F. Bruce of Manchester University said it best: the historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. It is not historians who propagate the Christ myth theory. And German scholar Otto Betz was equally direct. No serious scholar would venture to guess that Jesus did not exist. Let's look at why. Here's something that should stop you in your tracks. The most powerful evidence for the historical existence of Jesus doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from people who despised Christianity. Think about that for a moment. When your enemies confirm something about you, that confirmation carries extraordinary weight. They have absolutely no motive to help your cause. And yet, the Roman writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries, men who viewed Christianity with contempt, men who called it a dangerous superstition, repeatedly, independently, confirmed the existence of Jesus and the basic facts of his life and death. Cornelius Tacitus lived from approximately 55 to 120 AD. Scholars regard him as ancient Rome's greatest historian, a man of extraordinary moral integrity and meticulous accuracy. His two landmark works are the Annals and the Histories. In the Annals, while describing the reign of the Emperor Nero, Tacitus writes about the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Nero was blamed for starting it, and to deflect suspicion, he pinned the crime on the Christians. What Tacitus writes next is one of the most important non-Christian references to Jesus in all of ancient history. Here's what Tacitus wrote: to suppress this rumor, Nero falsely charged with the guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, with absolutely no sympathy for Christianity, confirms 5 specific facts. 1. There was a person named Christus. 2. He was executed under Pontius Pilate. 3. This happened during the reign of Tiberius. 4. The movement briefly scattered after his death. 5. But it broke out again, suggesting the disciples returned with a new message. Historian Marcus Bachmuhl of Cambridge University points out that this brief passage from a hostile source single-handedly refutes 2 popular skeptical theories. First, that there was no historical Jesus, and second, that he was not formally executed under Roman authority. And notice what Tacitus says about the movement after Jesus' death. It broke out again. Scholar Norman Anderson points out that Tacitus is, in all probability, unwittingly providing indirect witness to the early church's central conviction that the crucified Christ had risen from the dead. A hostile Roman source, writing only 80 years after the events, becomes an accidental witness to the resurrection faith. Lucian of Samosata was a Greek satirist writing in the 2nd century. He had nothing but contempt for Christianity. And yet, listen to what he writes about the Christians he's mocking. The Christians still worship that man, the one who was crucified in Palestine, for introducing this peculiar new cult. You see, these misguided creatures have the belief that they are going to be immortal. Their original lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers once they have denied the Greek gods and are worshiping that crucified sophist. Lucian is mocking. He's sneering. But notice what he never does. He never denies that Jesus existed. He never calls him a myth. He refers to him as a real, crucified man in Palestine, as historical fact. Suetonius was the official court historian of Emperor Hadrian. In his Life of Claudius, he writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from Rome." This is a reference to events in 49 AD, the same expulsion of Jews from Rome that Luke mentions in Acts chapter 18, when Aquila and Priscilla had to leave Rome and came to Corinth. Suetonius is writing about events within 20 years of the crucifixion. He's a hostile Roman official, and he independently confirms the existence of a Christian movement centered on someone called Christus, already disrupting the Roman capital less than 2 decades after Jesus died. This one is extraordinary. In 112 AD, the Roman governor of Bithynia, a man named Pliny the Younger, wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan asking for advice. He was facing a crisis. Too many Christians, and he didn't know what to do with them. He had already executed some. Here is part of what he wrote. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath that they would never do any wicked deeds, never commit any fraud, theft, or adultery. I therefore judged it so much the more necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from 2 female slaves who were styled deaconesses. Pliny also notes something chilling. He commanded them to curse Christ, and observed that those who are really Christians can never be made to do this. He's watching people die rather than deny their faith in a man who had been executed 80 years earlier. This is a Roman governor writing to the Emperor of Rome in 112 AD, asking for legal guidance on how to handle followers of Jesus. They were so numerous he was overwhelmed. They were worshiping Christ as God, taking binding oaths of moral integrity, and dying for their faith. Whatever your theology, that is a remarkable historical phenomenon, and it is independently attested by a hostile Roman source. Here's a detail that is rarely discussed, but is deeply significant. Thallus was a secular historian writing around 52 AD, just 20 years after the crucifixion. His works survive only in fragments quoted by other ancient writers. One of those writers, Julius Africanus, preserves this reference. Thallus wrote about a period of darkness that fell over the land during Passover and tried to explain it as a solar eclipse. Africanus responds, "But a solar eclipse can only occur during a new moon, and the Hebrews celebrate Passover on the 14th of Nisan, when the moon is at its full." Do you see what's happening? The darkness at the crucifixion, described in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23, was apparently visible and remarkable enough that a pagan historian writing just 2 decades later felt compelled to explain it. He didn't deny it happened. He tried to explain it naturalistically. Another secular writer, Phlegon, independently confirms the same event, a remarkable darkness during the time of Tiberius Caesar. Shortly after 70 AD, a Syrian man named Bar-Serapion was imprisoned by Rome. While in prison, he wrote a letter to his son, encouraging him to pursue wisdom. In it, he compares 3 great teachers who were unjustly killed: Socrates, Pythagoras, and a Jewish wise king who was executed by the Jews. He writes, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given." Bar-Serapion is clearly not a Christian. But notice what he never does. He never questions whether Jesus was a real person. He treats him as historical fact, in the same breath as Socrates and Pythagoras. If the Roman evidence for Jesus is powerful, the Jewish evidence is even more striking. Because here we have the testimony of people who actively opposed Jesus. The Jewish religious authorities of the first century were not neutral observers. They believed Jesus was a dangerous false teacher. They were involved in his execution. They watched his followers grow into a movement that was threatening their authority. If anyone had a motive to say Jesus never existed, it was them. And they never said it. Not once. Because the existence of Jesus was not a matter anyone debated in the first century. It was the nature and claims of Jesus that was disputed, never his existence. The Babylonian Talmud is a vast collection of Jewish rabbinic writing compiled over centuries. It contains several references to Jesus that are deeply revealing, precisely because they are hostile. In Tractate Sanhedrin 43a, we read, "It is taught, on the eve of Passover, Jesus was hanged. 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover." Now, this is stunning evidence. The Talmud confirms 5 specific facts. First, Jesus was a real person. Second, he was executed. The word hanged is a Jewish term for crucifixion, as the Apostle Paul uses it in Galatians chapter 3. Third, the timing, the eve of Passover, consistent with John's Gospel. Fourth, Jewish leaders were involved in his condemnation. Fifth, and this is critical, the Talmud does not deny that Jesus performed miracles. It cannot deny them because they were too well known. Instead, it explains them as sorcery. This is exactly what the Gospels record the Pharisees saying in Mark chapter 3. Even the enemies of Jesus had to account for his supernatural works. Jewish scholar Joseph Klausner confirms that hanged here indeed refers to crucifixion, a form of execution learned through the Roman judicial system. No discussion of the historical evidence for Jesus would be complete without Josephus. Josephus, full name Josephus ben Mattathias, was born around 37 AD, just a few years after the crucifixion. He was a Jewish priest, a military commander, and one of the most important historians of the ancient world. He wrote 2 massive works, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities. Josephus had every reason not to write favorably about Jesus. He was Jewish, he worked for Rome, and he was writing for a Gentile audience. He was not a Christian. He had no interest in promoting the Christian movement. And yet, in Jewish Antiquities, he mentions Jesus twice. Here's what most scholars accept as the authentic core of what Josephus wrote, the passage called the Testimonium Flavianum. "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. He was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of those who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following among many Jews and among many of Gentile origin. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. The tribe of the Christians, named after him, has not disappeared to this day." From a non-Christian Jewish historian writing within 60 years of the events, Jesus was a real person who performed remarkable deeds, who was condemned to the cross by Pilate at the instigation of Jewish leaders, and whose followers continued after his death. The second reference in Josephus is even less debated by scholars. In Antiquities Book 20, Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, who was stoned to death around 62 AD. Scholar Louis Feldman, who is not a Christian and who translated the Standard Loeb edition of Josephus, says of this passage, "Few scholars doubt the authenticity of this reference." Think about the logic. Josephus refers to James as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, as if his reader already knows who Jesus is from an earlier discussion. This second reference actually confirms the authenticity of the earlier Testimonium. Professor John P. Meyer of Notre Dame, whose multi-volume work on the historical Jesus is considered the standard in the field, concludes that the Josephus passages constitute reliable historical evidence. An independent, non-Christian, Jewish historian confirms the existence of Jesus. Now, I want to spend a moment on the Christian evidence, because I know some of you might think, of course Christians say Jesus existed, that proves nothing, and I understand that instinct. But here's what's often missed. The earliest Christian documents are not theological treatises written decades after the fact. Many of them are pre-literary formulas, creeds, hymns, and confessional statements that scholars can date to within a few years of the crucifixion itself. These are not legends that developed over centuries. This is early. This is raw. This is the testimony of people who were directly connected to eyewitnesses. New Testament scholar Gary Habermas has devoted decades to studying what he calls the pre-New Testament creeds, short formulas in use before Paul's letters were written. The most important is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 5. "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Paul explicitly says he received this formula, meaning he's transmitting a tradition older than his letter. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around 55 AD. But he first received this creed when he visited Jerusalem around 35 AD, just 2 to 5 years after the crucifixion, where he met with Peter and James. This is not legend. This is not mythology that developed over centuries. This is early. This is raw. This is the testimony of people who were there. Even Rudolf Bultmann, one of the most radical New Testament critics of the 20th century, a man who spent his career trying to demythologize the Gospels, even he admitted that the formula in Romans chapter 4 represents the earliest apostolic tradition transmitted to Paul. Gary Habermas has identified 17 specific historical claims preserved in these early creeds. Jesus was born of the seed of David. He gathered disciples. He was betrayed. He was crucified. He died. He was buried. He rose on the third day. He appeared to multiple witnesses. These are historical claims made within years of the events by people directly connected to eyewitnesses. Within one generation of the apostles, a remarkable set of early Christian writers independently confirmed the historical details of Jesus' life. Clement of Rome, writing in the late 1st century, confirmed the resurrection as the foundation of the apostolic message. And Ignatius of Antioch, martyred around 107 AD, writing his famous letters on the way to his own execution, repeatedly affirms the historical facts with striking insistence. Listen to the language he uses. Jesus was truly born of the seed of David according to the flesh. He truly suffered under Pontius Pilate. He was truly crucified and died. He truly rose from the dead. Notice that word, truly. Truly born, truly suffered, truly crucified, truly raised. He's defending the historical reality of Jesus against those who claimed these things were merely spiritual or symbolic. He is dying for his belief in a historical person. And then there is Quadratus, a disciple of the apostles, writing to the Emperor Hadrian around 125 AD. He offers this extraordinary claim. The works of our Savior were always present, for they were genuine. Those who were healed, those who rose from the dead, who were seen not only when they were healed and when they were raised, but were always present, so that some of them have also lived to our own times. Quadratus is telling the Roman emperor, the people Jesus healed are still alive. You can interview them. That's not the kind of claim you make if you're inventing a story. Let me now bring together the conclusions of serious scholars, not Christian apologists, but historians, classicists, and biblical scholars across the entire spectrum. Professor Howard Clark Key of Boston University, having examined all the extra-biblical evidence, concludes, "The results of our study of non-New Testament sources have directly or indirectly confirmed that Jesus was a historical figure, that he had extraordinary powers, that he had devoted followers, that he died at the hands of Roman rulers, that his movement survived his death, and that by the late 1st century, Christianity had penetrated the upper strata of Roman society." Professor Edwin Yamauchi of Miami University, one of the world's leading authorities on ancient history, states that the historical evidence for Jesus surpasses in quantity and quality the evidence for the founders of most of the world's other great religions. Yamauchi concludes, "Even if we did not have the New Testament writings from Josephus, the Talmud, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger alone, we could conclude, 1. Jesus was a Jewish teacher. 2. Many people believed he could perform healings and exorcisms. 3. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. 4. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. 5. Despite this shameful death, his followers believed he was still alive and spread this message beyond Palestine. And 6. By the early 2nd century, all kinds of people, men and women, slaves and free, were worshiping him as God." And the Encyclopedia Britannica, written by secular scholars with no theological agenda, allocated more words to Jesus of Nazareth than to any other historical figure in its 1974 edition, more than Aristotle, Caesar, Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, or Napoleon. Its editors concluded that even the ancient opponents of Christianity never doubted the historicity of Jesus. Let me close by stepping back and asking a wider question. Even if someone were to grant all the evidence we've covered today, even if they acknowledged Jesus was a real historical person, they might ask, so what? Here's why it matters. Yale historian Jaroslav Pelikan wrote, "Regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. If it were possible, with some sort of supermagnet, to pull out of that history every scrap of metal bearing his stamp, how much would be left? Art and science, the individual and society, politics and economics, marriage and the family, right and wrong, all have been shaped, and in many cases fundamentally transformed, by Christianity. This is the impact of one life that began in a stable in Bethlehem, one life that was cut short on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem, and the historical evidence confirms that life was real." Let me bring this home. We have examined 3 categories of evidence today. First, secular, non-Christian Roman sources: Tacitus, Lucian, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Thallus, Phlegon, Bar-Serapion, hostile witnesses, men with no motive to support Christianity, all of them confirming the existence of Jesus and the basic facts of his execution and the continuing movement of his followers. Second, Jewish sources: the Babylonian Talmud and Josephus, sources from people who actively opposed Jesus, who could have dismissed him as fiction but never did, because his existence was not in question. Only his claims were disputed. Third, Christian sources: pre-New Testament creeds dating to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion, corroborated by a generation of early Christian writers who died for their testimony. British New Testament scholar Howard Marshall puts it plainly, "If we do not accept that the founder of Christianity was a real historical person, then it is simply impossible to explain the rise of the Christian Church, the writing of the Gospels, and the traditions behind them." Now, proving that Jesus existed historically does not, by itself, prove that Jesus is Lord. That's a further step, one that requires examining the claims Jesus made about himself, the evidence for the resurrection, the fulfillment of prophecy, and the transformed lives of those who encountered him. And we will get to those things in future videos. But we have to start here. We have to start with the foundation. Jesus of Nazareth was not a myth. He was not an invention. He was not the product of wishful thinking or religious fiction. He was a man, a real man, a man who walked on the soil of first-century Palestine, who taught crowds by the Sea of Galilee, who stood before Pontius Pilate, who was nailed to a Roman cross outside Jerusalem, and then, according to the testimony of hundreds of people who were willing to die for that testimony, Something happened that no naturalistic historian has ever fully explained. That's a story worth investigating. My name is Alan. Thank you for watching Faith Glow Words. If this video has been helpful to you, please share it with someone who has questions about the historical Jesus. Subscribe, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video.